New York, 1930s. The Mafia's unstoppable killing machine, Murder Inc., is in its prime. They don't just kill, they organise murder like a conveyor belt of death, using hit lists, discreet weapons, and cold-blooded efficiency. They are the Mafia's murder-for-hire squad, responsible for over 500 murders across the country, and their victims are rivals, informants, anyone who gets in the Mafia's way. Amongst the deadliest members of this crew are the four men you see in front of you: Pittsburgh Phil, Kid Twist Reles, Bugsy Goldstein, and Happy Mayone. Killers who only answer to the mob bosses themselves and erase threats without a trace.
Poisoned, stabbed, buried alive, their methods are gruesome, their pride in their work unmatched, their results are unquestionable, and their proficiency undeniable. The moment that Murder Inc. was sent for you, you were already dead. This is the shocking true story of Murder Inc., the Mafia's killing machine.
The smell of gunpowder and blood lingered in the streets of Brooklyn, New York. It was 1930, and the city's criminal underworld was in chaos, torn apart by the brutal Castellammarese War. On one side was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mazzaria, an old-school mob leader, stubborn and stuck in tradition, demanding loyalty from his men. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, more ambitious, more modern, and full of pride. He saw himself as a new kind of leader, ready to bring structure to organised crime. Their followers, made up mostly of Italian-American gangsters, fought constantly for control over the city's biggest moneymakers: bootlegging, gambling, and extortion. For almost 2 years, the war didn't let up. Drive-by shootings became routine. Gunmen opened fire in social clubs. Corpses showed up wrapped in burlap, dumped in rivers, or left at doorsteps as warnings. People living in the neighbourhoods were scared. Businesses struggled. The police, either overwhelmed or on the payroll, did little to stop it. Some didn't even try. Inside the gangs, frustration was growing. Nobody could relax. Every meeting could be a setup. Every friend could be a traitor. And whilst the violence seemed endless, there was a bigger issue. It was hurting business. Too much attention, too many men lost. The non-stop bloodshed made it even harder to operate. Profits dropped. The fear and paranoia began to wear everyone down. Even for these mobsters used to violence, this war was too much.
But amongst the younger generation of mobsters, men who had grown up during Prohibition and saw organised crime as a business, not as a family feud, the constant violence felt outdated and pointless. One of those men was Charles Lucky Luciano, born in Sicily but raised in New York's Lower East Side. Luciano was practical, focused, and had a clear vision of how power should work. He had no interest in old traditions, in endless feuds over grudges that started in small villages back in Italy. To him, America's criminal world wasn't a war zone, it was a business opportunity. Luciano teamed up with others who thought the same way. Italians like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, and Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. They all agreed that the Castellammarese War was going nowhere. Fighting each other only led to more problems, more attention from law enforcement, and less money. Real power, they believed, came from unity, from having a system, a national organisation that could settle arguments, divide up territory, and make sure that everybody stayed in line like a business, not like a battlefield. But for that to happen, the old way of doing things had to go, and it had to go completely.
The first to go was Joe Mazzaria. On April the 15th, 1931, Luciano invited his boss to a seafood dinner at the Nuovo Via Tamaro restaurant in Coney Island. After eating and playing cards for a while, Luciano excused himself to go to the bathroom. Whilst he was gone, a group of gunmen including Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel and Joe Adonis walked in and opened fire. Masseria, who had survived many earlier attempts on his life, was caught completely off guard. He was still holding a playing card, an ace of spades, when the bullets hit him, mixing his blood with the remains of his dinner. With Masseria out the way, Salvatore Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He tried to take full control, pushing a strict system modelled after the Roman Empire. He wanted full obedience, but Lucky Luciano and his allies hadn't got rid of one dictator just to serve another. Maranzano's rule didn't last long. Sensing disloyalty from Lucky, Maranzano hired feared Irish hitman Mad Dog Coll to kill Luciano, but Lucky got word of this and acted first. Less than 5 months after Joe the Boss was killed, on September the 10th, 1931, a group of hitmen, Jewish gangsters led by Red Levine and hired by Meyer Lansky to avoid linking the job to Italian mobsters, entered Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building, located at 230 Park Avenue and now called the Helmsley Building. Dressed as government agents, they disarmed the guards, then shot and stabbed Maranzano to death. The message was simple: there would be no more kings in the American underworld. After both Masseria and Maranzano were gone, Luciano brought together leaders from the most powerful Italian-American crime families in the country. His idea was bold: to create a national board of directors for the Mafia, which he called the Commission. It would include the bosses of New York's 5 families, along with top figures from cities like Chicago, Buffalo, and Cleveland. The Commission would settle disputes, approve partnerships, and give the green light for major hits, but only when necessary. Personal grudges would no longer lead to all-out wars. Every decision would be made by vote, like a real business board. The goal was clear: make the organization more stable, more efficient, and far more profitable. And with that, the modern American Mafia was born.
The Commission was a smart setup, organised, powerful and built to control the criminal underworld. But it didn't take long to realise that rules and decisions alone were not enough. They needed a way to enforce them, a team that could act quickly, without hesitation, and make sure that everybody followed the new rules. The Commission's leaders wanted to keep their hands clean, to stay behind the scenes and avoid the mess. What they needed was a weapon, someone else to do the dangerous work, someone whose actions couldn't be directly tied back to them. They were looking for a group that could handle problems without asking too many questions, quiet when needed, but deadly when required. This crew wouldn't be part of the regular chain of command. They'd be the ones you called when things got serious, when someone stepped out of line or became a threat to the structure the Commission was building. Enter Murder Inc.
Brooklyn in the late 1920s and early 1930s was a place full of noise, people, and sharp contrasts. Some areas had quiet, tree-lined streets and a sense of order. Other places, like Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill, were crowded, rough, and poor. These neighborhoods were packed with new immigrants and the first generation of kids born in America. Life there wasn't easy. Money was tight, jobs were hard to get, and people did what they had to just to get by. For many young men growing up in these rundown buildings, the path to success seemed blocked. School and steady work didn't always feel like real options, but the streets offered something else. Fast money and a kind of respect that came with being feared. It didn't take much to get pulled in. Fights turned into favors turned into crime. And before long, some were doing serious things for really serious people. In neighborhoods like these, survival required more than just luck. It took nerve, toughness, and knowing the right people. That's how it started. The boys who grew up in these places would go on to become some of the most dangerous men in the country. They were the ones who carried out hits, enforced rules, and later even gave the orders. They didn't come from nowhere, they came from Brooklyn. No one understood how to turn crime into a business quite like Lepke Buchalter. His name already carried weight on New York streets. People feared him, but they also respected him. He wasn't the kind of guy who got into fights in alleyways. His real strength came from how smart and how organized he was. Working out of the city's garment district and controlling the unions in that industry, Lepke moved into other industries too, bakeries, trucking, and more. He built his power through labor racketeering. He didn't just break the law, he figured out how to profit from it, quietly and efficiently. His partner was Jacob Garage Shapiro, and he wasn't much of a talker, but he didn't need to be. Garaj's job was simple: show up, look tough, and make people think twice before saying no. Together, they controlled unions, forced businesses to pay for protection, and took in huge amounts of money.
If a strike was needed, Lepke made it happen. If one needed to end, it ended. Business owners knew better than to refuse him. Anyone who tried to stand up to them was, well, quickly dealt with, sometimes violently. Lepke planned everything. Garage backed him up. One had the brains, the other had the muscle. It worked because they stayed organised and professional, unlike many of the older street gangs who were more about chaos than control.
While Lepke focused on industries and unions, another name was rising in Brooklyn: Albert Anastasia. Known as the Mad Hatter, Anastasia was different. He wasn't calm or calculated. He was known for being explosive and dangerous. His world was the waterfront, the Brooklyn docks. This was a place full of stolen goods, under-the-table payments, and constant threats. Anastasia didn't just survive there, he took over. His temper was legendary, and he was quick to use violence when needed. He made his way up through the gangs on the docks by being ruthless. He realized early on that controlling the local chapters of the International Longshoremen's Association was key. Once he took hold of them, he never let go. Under Anastasia's control, the piers became his own territory. Goods went missing regularly, but only when he allowed it. Jobs were handed out to those who were loyal or paid him off. If someone challenged his control, he responded harshly. Sometimes the punishment was public, always brutal, and meant to send a message. Anastasia didn't plan things the way that Lepke did. He didn't need to. His power came from fear. He was a man who didn't hide what he was. His violence wasn't just a tool, it was who he was. While Lepke ran his criminal operations like a business, Anastasia ruled his territory like a warlord. Together, they showed two different faces of organized crime in New York. One quiet and efficient, the other was loud and terrifying, but both were effective and both were rising quickly. Lepke and Anastasia naturally crossed paths and formed a partnership. One of the most important early conflicts that helped shape what would become Murder Incorporated was the violent fight with the Shapiro brothers, Maya, Irving, and William. The Shapiros were already well known in Brooklyn, running their own rackets in areas like Williamsburg and Brownsville. They weren't interested in giving up territory to Lepke, who was quickly rising in power, but to Lepke, their refusal wasn't just bad for business, it was personal, and it needed a strong answer. Lepke got word out to every known hitman in the area, offering lucrative bounties on the heads of all of the Shapiro brothers. Irving Shapiro was the first to be killed. He was shot in his home at 691 Blake Avenue, Brooklyn, in July 1931. 2 months later, on the 17th of September 1931, his brother Mayer was found shot to death in the cellar of a Lower East Side tenement building in Manhattan. The message was clear: Lepke's group wasn't going to back down. The most chilling part of the conflict came on the 20th of July 1934, when the last brother, William "Willie" Shapiro, was killed. He had tried to disappear, but Lepke's hitmen eventually found him. What happened next would be talked about for years. According to testimony later given by informants, Willie was taken to an empty sandpit in Carnegie, far away from the city. There, a group of Lepke's men, including future Murder Inc. henchman Abe Reles and Martin Bugsy Goldstein, attacked him. They beat him and, as the story goes, buried him alive whilst he was still breathing.
Word of it spread quickly through the streets. If anyone had doubts about just how far Lepke's group was willing to go, those doubts vanished. Lepke's crew was willing to do anything to win. With all 3 Shapiros gone, their territory was now under Lepke's full control. His power had grown and his message had been heard, loud and clear. This ruthless setup attracted a new wave of young, violent men into Lepke's circle and, by extension, into the growing influence of Albert Anastasia. Their goals were starting to line up, and thus Lepke's band of Jewish killers was born. From Brownsville came Abraham Abe Reles, a small but aggressive thug known for his quick temper and even quicker use of weapons, especially an ice pick. He went by the nickname Kid Twist, named after his favourite way to kill, wringing a guy's neck. And like his nickname suggested, he had no moral compass. That made him exactly the kind of person Lepke needed. Alongside him was his close friend, Martin Bugsy Goldstein, a moniker earned from being crazy as a bedbug, just as brutal and eager to prove himself. Bugsy was the class clown of the crew. He had a habit of cracking one-liners just before carrying out a contract, so he'd do things like approach his victim and say, "You need me like a hole in the head, don't you?" before literally putting a hole in the guy's head. Whitey Krakow was another one of Lepke's trusted killers, along with Benny the Boss Tannenbaum, who ran some garment rackets for Lepke but could be called upon if needed. Frankie Carbo was a reliable gunman, previously working for Philadelphia gangster Mickey Duffy during Prohibition, and had recently found employment in Lepke's ranks. Over in Ocean Hill, another group of Italian-American street criminals was gaining attention. They were led by Harry Happy Maione, who rarely smiled, and his hot-headed second-in-command, Frank the Dasher Abendando, who ran away from the scene of murders laughing, hence the nickname. Maione was a solid, no-nonsense killer. Abendando was loud, unpredictable, and enjoyed the violence. These weren't polished mobsters like Lepke. They were rough guys from the streets, valued for their willingness to kill and follow orders without asking any questions. They had the raw aggression that men like Lepke and Anastasia could shape and use. The Italian members of Murder Inc. reported to Anastasia, and the Jewish members reported to Lepke. Beyond Happy and the Dasher, other fearsome figures were drawn into this violent crew. There was Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, a reportedly terrible gambler who was named after Pittsburgh Phil, one of the best gamblers of the 20th century. Strauss was a cold and efficient killer, but an absolute psychopath. He was responsible for around 500 murders himself, and he enjoyed it. He apparently took particular pleasure when reading the newspapers the day after a killing, and learned that he made the coroner vomit. Albert TikTok Tannenbaum, no relation to Benny the Boss, was another efficient hitman, and he once carried out a contract in less than 10 minutes. hence his nickname. And then there was Seymour Magoon, another violent killer known as Bluejaw amongst his colleagues, because 5 minutes after having a shave, it apparently looked like he needed another one straight away. The group also included Louis Capone, a loyal enforcer, and Mendy Weiss, a ruthless gunman. Their ranks swelled with other toughs like Charles the Bug Workman, named because he, like Bugsy, was crazy as a bedbug, Pretty Amberg, who wasn't the best looking of folks, and Sholem Bernstein. These men were the muscle, the enforcers who carried out the mob's grim work. As these different groups started working together, they needed a base, a quiet place where they could meet, hang around, and, most importantly, get their assignments. They found it in a small candy store called Midnight Roses in Brownsville, run by a woman named Rosie Gold. Rosie Gold herself was quite the character. She ran numbers from the window of the store, a kind of illegal lottery, and she also had a small brothel operating upstairs, of which she was the madam. From the outside it looked like any other neighbourhood spot. It sold candy, cigarettes, and newspapers, but inside, especially in the back room or near the payphone, things were different. This was where the top guys from Brooklyn's underworld gathered. Lepke's men, and sometimes Anastasia's, would show up to pass along orders. The killers would sit around playing cards, drinking coffee, and waiting for the phone to ring. That call usually meant someone was going to die. As time passed, the men became more well acquainted with each other and become a trusted killing crew. Thus, Murder Inc. was born.
Between 1935 and 1940, Murder Inc. reached the height of its power. Under the quiet, careful leadership of Lepke Buchalter and the brutal control of Albert Anastasia, Murder Inc. operated as the hit squad for the National Crime Syndicate. They didn't just clean up problems, they erased them efficiently and without leaving a trace. The days of messy gang fights were over. In their place came a new kind of crime, cold, planned, and run like a business. Murder was no longer personal, it was part of the job. A service offered, a task assigned, a payment received. By this time, murder wasn't just a way to protect power, it was the system itself.
The way it worked was surprisingly straightforward, especially for something so deadly. It followed a chain of command, not unlike a regular company. When a problem came up, another gang moving in, someone suspected of being an informant, or perhaps a politician making too much noise, the issue would be taken to the top, and that meant the commission. A group of the most powerful mafia bosses would meet, talk it through, and decide whether the person in question should be eliminated. If they agreed, the hit was officially approved. It was cold, calculated, and strangely formal.
Once approved, the job usually landed in the hands of Lepke. He was calm, smart, and knew how to keep things running smoothly. Albert Anastasia was experienced in murder, and between them, they organised who did what and when. The call to Midnight Roses was made by Lepke, and Murder Inc. treated it like any other job.
Orders were given strictly on a need-to-know basis. No member of Murder Inc. ever knew the full picture. They didn't know the target personally, and they had no idea which mafia family had ordered the hit. Each man was assigned a specific task, with only the information needed to carry it out. Nothing more. For example, the bug workman might be told to steal a car and park it at a specific location. Mendy Weiss would then arrive at 6 PM to swap out the license plates. After that, perhaps Kid Twist Reles would drive the car to the final drop point where Pittsburgh Phil, the triggerman, would be waiting with coordinates in hand to carry out the hit. It was a methodical, compartmentalised system designed to keep the machine running smoothly, avoid informants, and ensure that no single man ever knew too much.
They weren't driven by rage or revenge. For most of them, it was work. Something they did with a strange sense of pride in how cleanly and quickly they could get it done. The killers were paid a regular salary as a retainer, an average fee of $1,000 to $5,000 per killing, and their families also received monetary benefits. They studied their targets carefully, watched their daily routines, looked for weak spots, and always knew how they'd get away. They used whatever tools were right for the job: an ice pick, often pushed through the ear or the side of the head, a .38 revolver, easy to use and just as easy to toss, or even a rope for when they needed to stay quiet. No one showed this cold approach better than Harry Strauss. He dressed sharp and acted calm, like someone you'd meet at a train station, not someone who killed for a living. But Pittsburgh Phil was one of the most active hitmen in Murder Inc., possibly responsible for over 500 killings. He never carried a weapon on him, and he would always choose something at the scene to carry out the murder. Some say this was to minimize evidence and motive for the police. Others say it was to make the hit more exciting for him, but one thing everyone agreed on was his complete lack of emotion, no matter who he was sent to kill. For Strauss, murder wasn't personal, it was just another task to check off the list. The power and reach of the syndicate became clear with the murder of Abe Wagner, a New York bootlegger. He met a violent end in 1932, a victim of the fierce underworld rivalries of the Prohibition era. After surviving an attack from the Mazza gang, Wagner, who preferred peace over bloodshed, sought to negotiate. However, his brother Ali was murdered during a meeting with the Mazzas, who were backed by Lucky Luciano. This prompted Abe to flee with his wife, Goldie. However, Luciano gave the contract on his life to Murder Inc., and their whereabouts in Hopewell, New Jersey were inadvertently revealed by police investigating the Lindbergh kidnapping, leading to another attempt on his life, which Wagner survived by killing his attacker. They then moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where Wagner tried to live anonymously, running a fruit stand. Despite his efforts, he was found by members of Murder Inc. and brutally killed whilst eating dinner. Pittsburgh Phil and Bugsy Goldstein both stabbed him with an ice pick in front of his family. The next high-profile murder was Arthur Flegenheimer, who was better known as Dutch Schultz, and he was an unpredictable and violent mob boss from the Bronx. By 1935, Schultz was losing control. He was under serious legal pressure from Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who was taking apart his operation one step at a time.
We have made a real start on cleaning the gangsters out of New York.
With crack New York detectives, Dewey's roundups was skillfully directed. Mob after mob was taken by surprise. Simultaneously, all over the city, the underworld was rounded up.
Schultz, known for his impulsive and aggressive nature, came up with a drastic plan. He wanted to kill Dewey. He believed that this would solve his problems, so he brought the drastic idea to the commission, hoping they'd back him.
Let him knock me down. Well, Stella, you're next. Farkas, you and you and you and you. One at a time. He hits one, he hits all.
But they didn't. Albert Anastasia had been tasked with the job of staking out Dewey's routine. Anastasia moved with caution and cunning. Disguised as a woman, a devoted mother pushing a baby's carriage, he blended into the neighbourhood while studying prosecutor Thomas Dewey's morning routine. He watched Dewey's apartment building while accompanied by another young boy riding a tricycle, a clever diversion that drew no suspicion and added to his doting mother persona. Neither Dewey nor his security detail ever gave Anastasia and his supposed children a second thought. For 4 consecutive mornings, the attentive father tailed Dewey. He learned that the prosecutor typically left home at around 8 AM, walking to a nearby pharmacy to use the payphone. This was to both avoid waking his wife and to steer clear of potential wiretaps on his home line. Whilst Dewey made the call inside, his bodyguards waited on the sidewalk outside. The pieces of the plan began to fall into place. The hitman would enter the pharmacy shortly before Dewey arrived. Once Dewey stepped into the phone booth, the killer would shoot him and then eliminate the pharmacist to remove the only witness. Using a silencer, the murders would go unnoticed by the guards outside. The assassin would then calmly exit the store, stroll past the unsuspecting bodyguards, and slip around the corner into a waiting getaway car. The plan seemed solid, but at a syndicate meeting in October, Schultz struggled to gain support. Only Garage Shapiro, a garment district racketeer, backed the Dutchman. Lucky Luciano and the syndicate leaders, men like Myalansky, Louis Lepke, Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, realised they were focused on long-term control and not on chaos. Killing a well-known government figure like Dewey would draw huge amounts of law enforcement pressure and public attention. It would put the entire national operation at risk. The commission told Schultz to stand down, but Dutch wouldn't listen. He was proud, angry and out of options. He stormed out of a meeting with the commission and vowed that he'd whack Dewey within 48 hours with or without their approval, and this sealed his fate. To the syndicate, someone challenging their authority and risking everything they'd built so far was a no-go, so they acted quickly. The decision was unanimous. Dutch Schultz had to die. The hit was given to Lepke Buchalter, and thus to Murder Inc.
Lepke was practical and careful when choosing his team. He picked Charles the Bug Workman, who despite his nickname was known as a calm, reliable hitman who was very proud of the fact that he had 20 notches on his pistol, meaning he had killed 20 people for the commission and had never got the wrong guy, something rare for a hitman in the 1930s. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, a trusted member of Murder Inc. who was smart and willing to get his hands dirty, was also chosen for the task. On the night of the 23rd of October 1935, it was raining and Dutch Schultz was at the Palace Chop House at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey, which was his new headquarters. It was a good distance from his usual Bronx hangouts, but he wasn't exactly safe. The mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, had kicked him out of the city and told the NYPD to shoot him on sight if he returned.
Let the gamblers, tin horns, racketeers and gangsters take notice that they have to keep away from New York from now on.
Workman and Weiss walked into the tavern at around 11 p.m. People were eating, drinking, talking, nothing unusual. Then everything changed in seconds. They opened fire and killed 3 of Schultz's top men, Otto Abadaba Berman, who handled his finances, Abe Landau, his lead bodyguard, and Lulu Rosenkrantz, his driver and muscle. They then found Schultz in the men's room and shot him twice with a .38 revolver. It was quick, brutal, and well organised.
You're fucking kidding me. They send you.
What they left behind was chaos. Blood on the floors, bodies slumped in chairs and sprawled on the tiles. Dutch Schultz didn't die right away. He hung on for almost 24 hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, speaking nonsense as he faded. His final hours were filled with strange rambling phrases that became an odd piece of mob history. He died the next day, aged 34. The Palace Chop House hit would go down as one of the most famous executions in organised crime history. But Murder Inc. were not done there. The very next day after the Dutch Schultz hit, Louis Pretty Amberg, a former member of Murder Inc., was killed along with his brother. So Pretty Amberg had helped run the rackets in the garment industry for Lepke, but he had recently broke free and attempted to carve out territory of his own. And this didn't go down well. On the morning of October the 23rd, 1935, Pretty Amberg's body was discovered in the backseat of a burning car across from 131 North Elliott Place in Brooklyn. He had been stripped of his clothing, his hands bound with wire, and a sack placed over his head. A witness who first noticed the fire reported seeing several men fleeing the scene, and for the brutal trail of death Murder Inc. would leave, this was just the beginning.
In 1939, things got worse in New York's criminal world, especially because of Murder Inc. That year saw many violent deaths, mostly of people who made enemies, knew too much, or got in the way of powerful criminals.
The year began with 2 shocking murders that showed just how ruthless Lepke Buchalter was. On January the 28th, 1939, the bodies of Louis Cohen and Isidore Freeman were found, killed in a violent and deliberate way that rattled both the criminal world and District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey. Freedman had agreed to help Dewey by testifying against Buchalter. His help was crucial to Dewey's plan to break up Buchalter's control over labour unions. Cohen, whose real name was Louis Kushner, was a well-known gangster too. He had once killed a rival named Kid Dropper Kaplan, apparently for Lepke. It's unclear if Cohen was also a target because he was suspected of turning against Buchalter, or if he was just caught up in the attack meant for Freedman. Either way, the message was clear: anyone who helped the authorities would be killed. The fact that they were murdered right before Freedman was supposed to testify showed how bold and powerful Buchalter really was. Word on the street was that a man named Jacob Cuppy Midgen pulled the trigger, just one of the 250 Jewish hitmen of Murder Inc. that was working for Lepke.
On April the 25th, 1939, one of Lepke's enforcers from the garment industry, Abraham Whitey Freedman, no relation to Isidore, was murdered on a New York City street. Freedman had recently been released from jail, where he spent 6 months facing charges on a garment industry racketeering case led by District Attorney Dewey. During his time in jail, Freedman talked to the authorities, which led to his bail being significantly lowered from $35,000 to $15,000. This allowed him to gain his freedom whilst awaiting the arrest of his boss, Louis Lepke Buchalter. On the night of his murder, Freedman was walking near his home at 22 East 96th Street when a car pulled up next to him. A man jumped out and shot him twice, once in the back and once in the left shoulder. Freedman died before help could arrive. Shortly after the shooting, the car used in the murder was found at East New York and Ralph Avenues. Inside, under the front seat, investigators discovered a double-barreled shotgun, believed to be the murder weapon, and a .22 caliber pistol. Pittsburgh Phil is believed to have pulled the trigger, with Mendy Weiss driving. The violence of 1939 wasn't confined to the East Coast, however. On November the 22nd, 1939, Harry Greenberg was killed in his driveway at 1804 North Vista Del Mar in Hollywood. His wife, Ida Greenberg, found him after he'd been shot 5 times in the head. Prosecutors stated that Bugsy Siegel, Whitey Krakow, and Frankie Carbo were involved in the murder. It was said that Siegel led the killers to Greenberg's house and drove one of the escape cars, whilst Carbo was accused of being the shooter. Greenberg had reportedly asked Louis Buchalter for $5,000, about $113,000 in today's money, to keep quiet about what he knew from the police about a group called Murder Inc. Buchalter then ordered Greenberg's killing.
Even people who had worked with Buchalter closely weren't safe from his power. Hyman Curly Holtz, also known as Little Jaime, was a New York labor racketeer whose life ended violently, a common fate in the dangerous underworld he inhabited. Holtz began his criminal career working for Jacob Organ in the early 1920s. However, Holtz, along with others like Lepke, grew unhappy with Organ, especially after Organ accepted a $50,000 payoff during a strike without sharing it. That led Holtz to break away and join forces with Lepke Buchalter. Holtz quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a close associate of Lepke. He was even suspected of being involved in the drive-by shooting that killed little Augie Organ in 1927. Holtz himself was a target of violence, surviving a drive-by shooting in November 1927, which left him injured. As time went on, Holtz became deeply involved in Buchalter's drug trafficking business, which reportedly moved millions of dollars in heroin and morphine from China into the United States. However, this lucrative but perilous venture would ultimately be his undoing. Buchalter, always suspicious and ruthless, came to believe that Holtz was skimming money from the drug operations. In the brutal world of organised crime, such an accusation was a death sentence. Hyman Curly Holtz was stabbed to death by Murder Inc. on orders from Buchalter. They later found his body in the East River, tied to a slot machine. It's thought that Pittsburgh Phil carried out this one. He liked to dump bodies in the East River, but a person's stomach inflates with air after they die, so he found that the bodies kept floating. Thus he bought a warehouse and numerous slot machines and began tying his victims to the machines so that they sunk. A little brutal and stomach-turning insight into the mind of probably the most prolific hitman of the 20th century.
The year 1940 began with quiet tension amongst the top figures in organised crime. Murder Inc. had run its operations smoothly for almost 10 years, killing without much interference. For a while, it had managed to stay hidden behind fear and silence, but the rumours were getting harder to ignore. More people were talking, and now even the higher-ups in the commission couldn't pretend nothing was wrong. In Brooklyn, which was the heart of Murder Inc.'s activity, a new threat was rising. William O'Dwyer, the new district attorney, had started speaking out more openly. He wanted to clean up the city's criminal networks, and he wasn't shy about saying so. O'Dwyer was no outsider. He was an Irish immigrant who had climbed the ranks from street cop to prosecutor. He understood how the streets worked and knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. People in Brooklyn believed he had big dreams, maybe even a run for mayor or higher. Bringing down Murder Inc. could be the thing that launched his political career.
For the confidence they have reposed in me by this election.
But taking them down wouldn't be easy. The biggest problem was the silence. No one talked. No one testified. The whole operation had been built on fear and loyalty. If O'Dwyer was going to win, he needed someone inside to crack. Lepke Buchalter was already feeling the heat. He had helped build Murder Inc. into a deadly machine, but by 1939 he felt the walls were closing in. On July the 29th of that year, Thomas Dewey requested that the City of New York offer a $25,000 reward for Buchalter's capture, citing a string of unsolved gangland murders. Then, on August the 24th, after months on the run, Lepke turned himself in. But he didn't go to the local police or to O'Dwyer's office. He gave himself up to the FBI chief, J. Edgar Hoover, in front of a Manhattan hotel on federal drug charges, hoping a lighter sentence would protect him from a death penalty back in New York. It was a smart move, at least on the surface. He thought prison time for a federal offence was better than risking the electric chair, but O'Dwyer wasn't going to let him off that easily. He wanted Lepke tried for murder. He pushed to have him brought back to New York to face the most serious charges, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. As the case grew, so did the pressure, not just on Lepke, but on everyone tied to Murder Inc. The people who had once felt untouchable were starting to worry. The law was closing in. O'Dwyer's mission wasn't just about one man, it was about breaking the entire system, and he knew this was his chance. What he needed now, more than anything, was a witness, someone to open the door and let the rest of the truth spill out. But the question was, who'd be the first to talk, and what would they say when they did?
The break O'Dwyer had been waiting for didn't come from some big move at the top. It came, as it often does in organised crime, from the inside. Abe Reles, the man they called Kid Twist, small in size but known for his brutal streak, was one of Murder Inc.'s most feared hitmen. He had killed plenty of people over the years using ice picks and guns, and somehow always managed to avoid serious jail time despite having 49 arrests on his record. Fear, silence, and a few helpful connections kept him out of reach, but now that was starting to change. One case in particular was catching up to him: the 1936 murder of 46-year-old Joseph Rosen. Rosen wasn't a big player. He ran a candy shop at 725 Sutter Avenue in Brooklyn and had once worked in the garment trucking business for Lepke. But he knew too much. He had seen how Lepke was running the garment industry rackets, and worse, people suspected he might be ready to talk. That alone sealed his fate. Lepke gave the order to take him out. The actual hit was carried out by members of Murder Inc., including Mendy Weiss, Louis Capone, Harry Strauss, James Farraco, and Sholem Bernstein. They ambushed Rosen in his store, shooting him multiple times. Years passed, but the murder stayed on the books. In O'Dwyer's office, his top assistant, Burton Turkus, wasn't letting it go. Turkus was sharp, stubborn, and convinced he had enough to finally bring Reles down, not just to court, but to the electric chair in Sing Sing. They called it Old Sparky, and Turkus was aiming to send Reles straight to it. In early 1940, the net closed in. Reles, Lepke, and a handful of other hitmen from Brownsville were arrested. The charge, the murder of Joseph Rosen.
And now a respectable citizen has been killed by bullets.
For the first time, Reles wasn't in control. The law had caught up, and the walls were closing in fast.
Locked up in jail, Abe Kid Twist Reles started to fall apart. The tough guy who once ruled the streets was suddenly just another man staring down a future he couldn't talk his way out of. He knew what prosecutors O'Dwyer and Turkus were building against him. He knew the odds. When a case was strong and the lawyers were serious, men like him didn't walk free. He could already picture the electric chair, feel the straps, smell the burn. The gangster code, the rule that said you never talk, meant nothing when death was on the line. Reles had always been ruthless, but more than that, he'd always been a survivor. No one really knows who made the first move. Maybe Reles started to panic and hinted he might want to talk. Or maybe the prosecutors picked up on his fear and offered him a way out. What we do know is that Reles started to consider something unthinkable in his world, turning informant, becoming a snitch, becoming a canary.
Burton Turkus, who was leading the case against Murder Inc., knew exactly how to work a guy like Reles. He didn't need threats, just the promise of staying alive. He offered Reles a deal: full protection, no charges for the murders he'd admit to, and thus a way to avoid the chair. All Reles had to do was tell the full truth about his old partners, from the shooters on the street to the bosses calling the shots, including names like Lepke and Albert Anastasia. For a man raised in the world of gang loyalty, betrayal and silence, the choice must have been massive. If he took the deal, he wouldn't just be hated, he'd be hunted. A dead man walking if his police guard ever slipped. His name would be dirt in every corner of Brooklyn, but the alternative, that was the chair, a sure end. Faced with that choice, Reles did what he always did, he chose survival, even if it meant turning on everyone he once stood beside, even if it meant living every day knowing that they'd all want him dead.
I thought we'd talk over our little deal.
Abe Reles talked and he didn't hold back. The stenographers were summoned and he talked about everything. About how Irving Puggy Feinstein, a small bookie who had crossed Albert Anastasia, was tricked into showing up at a house. There, Harry Strauss strangled him. They moved his body to a vacant lot, poured gasoline over it, and set it on fire. He also described the murder of George Rudnick, someone they thought might be an informant. First, Frank Abendando stabbed him with an ice pick. When that didn't finish the job, Harry Maione hit him in the head with a meat cleaver. Then there was the killing of Walter Sage, a loan shark. Pittsburgh Phil and Bugsy Goldstein had planned it carefully. Irving Gangy Cohen brought the slot machine in the back of a truck, and Sage was stabbed numerous times with an ice pick before being tied to it and dumped in the middle of Swan Lake in the Catskills, where, despite being tied to a slot machine, his body floated unexpectedly to the surface. The trick didn't always work. The stories Reles told were shocking, graphic, specific, and far too detailed to be fabricated. He put himself and his partners at the centre of nearly 80 murders. Prosecutors William O'Dwyer and Burton Turkis instantly knew what they had. Not just a witness, but a game changer. News that Reles had flipped spread fast through the criminal world. At first, people were in disbelief. Then came the panic. Abe Reles, the man they nicknamed Kid Twist after his favourite way of killing, had always been one of the most feared killers in the mob. If someone like him could turn, who else might be next? Lepke Buchalter, already in jail and trying to avoid being sent back to New York, was shaken. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High executioner, didn't usually show emotion, but this time, even he was rattled. His name came up too often in Reles' stories. He had given the orders, and now those orders were being exposed. Murder Inc., a group built on fear and loyalty, suddenly looked fragile. Behind the scenes, messages flew, plans were made, how to stop Reles, how to protect secrets, and how to stop others from doing the same. O'Dwyer understood what he was dealing with. Reles was now the most important and most endangered witness in the history of organised crime. His protection became the top priority. A full security plan was put in place. Around-the-clock guards were assigned, working in shifts with no gaps. At first, Reles was moved between safe houses, and later he was put in a set of rooms on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel overlooking the Atlantic Ocean on Coney Island. The place was heavily guarded. Every meal was tested for poison. Every visitor was checked. The windows were locked. The hallways were constantly guarded by 6 armed guards. But danger hung over everything. Reles knew that anyone he had named, anyone still alive, wanted him dead. His guards knew it too. Any mistake, even a moment of distraction, could mean the end. For the prosecutors, the pressure was huge. Reles had to stay alive long enough to testify in trial after trial. His stories were being backed up by facts, but that wouldn't stop defense lawyers from trying to break him. They had to protect not just his body, but also his credibility.
The first big test of Abe Reles' testimony and the state's willingness to go after the mob focused on 2 of the most feared men from Brownsville and Ocean Hill. Harry Happy Maione, known for his constant scowl and the leadership of the Ocean Hill hooligans, and Frank the Dasher Abundando, his flashy and violent right-hand man. They were charged with the brutal murder of George Rudnick in May 1937, a small-time moneylender and suspected police informant. Once again, the prosecution's key witness was Abe Reles. He explained that Rudnick had been marked for death because they believed that he was a stool pigeon for the police, something Reles had now become. Reles told the court that Strauss had suggested leaving a note in Rudnick's pocket as a message from Lepke. The idea was to make it look like Rudnick had testified against Lepke for District Attorney Thomas Dewey, and to use it as a warning for anyone else thinking about cooperating with law enforcement. Reles said that they had trouble typing the note though. He held the paper while Strauss typed, but they argued over how to spell the word friend. Strauss spelled it one way and Reles disagreed. They tore up two versions of the note and eventually gave up trying to get it perfect and opted for Plan B.
Reles described how he and Abundando waited for him to leave his house at 95 Barrett Street in Brooklyn, whilst Maione and Strauss waited in a garage on Atlantic Avenue. Around 4:30 in the morning, Rudnick came by and Abundando pulled up to the curb and offered him a ride. Reles waited 10 minutes and then followed them to the garage. He said he knocked on the door and Maione answered, telling him the job was done. Strauss stepped inside and called across the street to Julie Catalano, a wheelman for Murder Inc. Inside, Reles saw Strauss holding an ice pick and Maione with a meat cleaver. Rudnick's body was on the floor. They tried to load the body into the car, but Rudnick was too tall, so they bent his legs. When Rudnick made a sound, Strauss said he wasn't dead yet and stabbed him in the throat with the ice pick. Maione hit him in the head with the meat cleaver and said that should finish the job. Afterwards, Reles said they cleaned up the garage floor with a bucket of water and wiped the weapons to remove fingerprints. Maione got into his own car whilst Catalano drove the car with Rudnick's body, leaving it parked in front of 1190 Jefferson Street in Brooklyn between Evergreen and Central Avenue. Reles and the others followed in separate vehicles. The jury was especially disturbed by the way Rudnick was killed, and in the end, they found both Happy Maione and Frank the Dasher Abundando guilty of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to death. The plan to break apart Murder Inc. was working. It sent a message that the state was now serious about punishing even the syndicate's most violent hit squad. Maione and Abundando were executed in Old Sparky on February the 19th, 1942. Hardly had the ink dried on their verdict when another trial began. This time on trial were two of the most feared killers from Brownsville, Harry Strauss and Bugsy Goldstein. The charge: the September 1939 murder of Irving Puggy Feinstein, a low-level bookie who had made the mistake of crossing mob boss Albert Anastasia. With the prosecutor Burton Turkis leading him, Reles, the main witness, walked the jury through the killing in chilling detail. He said that Feinstein had been killed in his own home on East 91st Street in Brooklyn. Once Feinstein arrived, Reles said that he, Strauss and Goldstein attacked. Goldstein held Puggy down while Strauss used a clothesline to strangle him. Reles described everything: the way that Puggy struggled, how his eyes bulged, the sound of his last breath. He also admitted that Puggy was stabbed 50 times with an ice pick by Reles himself. After the killing, the three of them wrapped the body in a blanket, drove it to an empty lock in Cypress Hills, poured gasoline over it, and lit it on fire to cover up the evidence. Reles even remembered Bugsy Goldstein complaining that Puggy Feinstein only had $8 in his pockets.
The defense lawyers, experienced and well paid by the syndicate, came at Reles hard. They tried to destroy his credibility, calling him a liar, a killer, who was only talking to save his own life. They said he made up the whole story to get a deal from the district attorney, but Reles, who had spent countless hours preparing with prosecutor Burton Turkis, stayed calm. His memory was sharp and his story never changed. Turkis also had strong evidence to support Reles' story. Details from the crime scene matched Reles' story, and Reles' mother-in-law said that Reles and Strauss had asked her for an ice pick and clothesline earlier that day. While at the house, she heard loud music covering up a noise from the living room. During the trial, Pittsburgh Phil had grown a beard and was faking insanity to try and avoid the electric chair. But it was to no avail. At 6:15 p.m. on September the 19th, 1940, the jury gave their decision: guilty of first-degree murder for both Strauss and Goldstein. After the verdict was read, they had to be helped out of the courtroom. Strauss was mumbling and dragging his feet, whilst Goldstein shouted, "Don't I deserve a chance to say one little word before I die?" Judge Fitzgerald sentenced them both to die in Old Sparky at Sing Sing, and they were put to death in the electric chair on June the 12th, 1941. By 1941, Murder Inc. was imploding. Its members were dropping like flies, executed almost monthly. Loose lips sink ships, and Abe Reles was sinking them faster than Lepke and Anastasia could plug the holes. Desperate to cover their tracks and avoid a date with Old Sparky themselves, they turned on their own. Anyone who might talk was seen as a threat. In the first half of 1941 alone, 3 insiders, Benny the Boss Tannenbaum, Whitey Krakow, and James Farrico, were taken out by fellow hitmen, primarily Frankie Carbo and Blue Jaw Magoon, 2 killers Lepke and Anastasia trusted to stay silent. Even lesser players were not spared. If you knew too much, you were a liability. Sidney Shimmy Salz and Tony Romero Ragnoello were both murdered in June 1941, just in case they talked. But those men were small fries in comparison to the big fish that the duo wanted: Abe Reles.
These cases were major wins for prosecutors O'Dwyer and Turkis, but they weren't done. The biggest target was still out there: Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner, was their main prize. Reles had named Anastasia as the man behind several murders, including the 1939 killing of Pete Panto. Panto had been a young union leader who wanted to clean up the docks in Brooklyn. He had openly stood up to Anastasia and then disappeared. Reles said that Anastasia gave the order to kill him, and that his body was buried in concrete and dumped. Pete Panto's body was found in January 1941 in a lime pit in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, thanks to Abe Reles. Prosecutors were building a case against Anastasia for Panto's murder, but they needed one thing: Reles' testimony in court. Without it, the case against Anastasia would fall apart, and getting Reles to the courtroom was going to be a challenge of its own. Security around Abe Reles was already tight, but after he agreed to testify against Albert Anastasia, it was taken to another level. He was still in room 623 of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, under 24/7 guard by a rotating team of 6 police officers. He couldn't go anywhere without someone watching. Everyone knew if he testified against Albert Anastasia the same way he had against Strauss, Goldstein, Maione and Abendando, it would be the end for Anastasia. The mob felt the walls closing in. The pressure to shut Reles up grew intense, and a $100,000 bounty was placed on his head, a staggering sum at the time, worth almost $2 million today. Just before sunrise on November the 12th, 1941, something happened that no one expected. Reles' body was found on the kitchen roof of the hotel, 3 stories below the window of his 6th floor room. Abe Reles was dead. The man nicknamed Kid Twist, the canary who'd brought down half of his crew, was suddenly silent for good. Police were quick to explain what happened, maybe too quick. Their version was that Reles had grown desperate. Maybe he wanted to escape. Maybe he thought he could rejoin the mob, though that made little sense. Still, they said he tied 2 bedsheets together and tried to climb out of the window. One of the knots slipped and he fell. That was their story. The 6 officers on duty claimed they were in the next room and they didn't hear a thing. But for a man that valuable, with a team of armed guards just feet away, that explanation raised more questions than it answered. To people in the criminal world, and to most of New York, the answer was simple. Someone had killed him, thrown out of the window by professionals who either got past the police or had help from someone on the inside. No one ever proved it. The police gave their version and official statements didn't go far, but most people thought that they were covering something up. What really happened in that hotel room stayed unclear, but all 6 police officers who were guarding Reles were demoted the next day.
For District Attorney William O'Dwyer and Prosecutor Burton Turkis, Reles's death was a disaster. He had already helped put some major murdering hitmen behind bars. He was also a key witness in the ongoing case against Lepke Buchalter, but most of all, he was the star witness against Albert Anastasia. Reles was supposed to testify that Anastasia ordered the murder of Pete Panto, amongst other crimes. Now that testimony would never happen. Even though Reles had told the grand jury plenty, prosecutors needed him in court. They needed him to sit in the witness chair, point the finger, and handle cross-examination. That was how the justice system worked. Without him, the case against Anastasia fell apart. Anastasia, who had been keeping his head down in Pennsylvania, waiting to see what happened, was now safe. Well, at least from those charges. The law couldn't go after him for the Panto murder without its main witness. And a witness who's dead? Well, he can't say anything. He can't answer any questions. He can't handle cross-examination. He can't face the man that he accused.
Abe Reles may have died under suspicious circumstances, but his testimony remained one of the strongest pieces of evidence against Lepke Buchalter. Before he fell to his death from the window of the Half Moon Hotel, Reles had spoken in front of a Brooklyn grand jury. He told them how Lepke, convinced that a man named Joseph Rosen was working with prosecutor Thomas Dewey, had personally ordered Rosen's murder. Reles described meetings where the plan was discussed, who was there, and what Lepke told them to do. Even after his death, Reles's sworn statements were used in court. His words became a key part of the case. But Reles wasn't the only one who spoke out. Another insider, TikTok Tannenbaum, also came forward. A hitman for Murder Inc., with killings on both coasts, including a high-profile murder of Harry Greenberg in California. Tannenbaum agreed to testify. Unlike Reles, he was still alive, able to speak in court and tell the jury exactly what he knew. He said that Lepke often gave direct orders to kill, including the hit on Joseph Rosen.
Speak up! Speak!
He said, I want Rosen hit. I want that son of a bitch dead.
Lepke used trusted men like Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, no relation to Al Capone, to pass on instructions and make sure the murders were carried out. According to Tannenbaum, Lepke acted like a boss running a business. He didn't kill people himself, but he made all the decisions. If you crossed him or let him down, you were as good as dead. Tannenbaum's account was backed up by other smaller players who had also been involved in Murder Inc. One of them was Sholem Bernstein, who wasn't at the centre of the action, but still knew enough to support what the others were saying. Together, these testimonies painted a clear picture. Lepke wasn't just involved, he was in charge. The trial of Lepke Buchalter, along with his close associates Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, began on November the 30th, 1941, in a crowded Brooklyn courtroom of Kings County Court. Judge Franklin Taylor was on the bench. The case drew intense attention. Lepke, long known as the man behind Murder Inc., was finally being brought to trial for a killing. After years of whispers and rumours, he was now facing a jury for the murder of Joseph Rosen. He showed up calm and composed, dressed neatly, barely reacting to the chaos around him.
William O'Dwyer and Burton Turkus led the case against him. Turkus presented the evidence with care, laying out a narrative built on witness testimony, both living and dead. Abe Reles' earlier statements were still part of the case. The main witness against Louis Lepke was Max Rubin, a former schoolteacher who became involved in labour racketeering. He was one of Lepke's most trusted men and helped collect money for him. Rubin testified that he once heard Lepke threaten to silence a man named Rosen to keep him from talking. Later, Rubin said that he overheard Lepke and another associate, Mendy Weiss, discussing Rosen's shooting. After giving information to a grand jury about Lepke's operations, Rubin was shot in the head whilst walking on a Manhattan street. The attack seemed to be an attempt to stop him from speaking out, but Rubin survived. He later took the stand and testified against Lepke in 3 separate trials. Despite the risks, he played a major role in helping the authorities build a case.
When it finally ended, the jury took just over 4 hours to decide. On December the 2nd, 1941, they came back with their verdict. The court clerk asked for the decision on Louis Buchalter. The room was quiet as the jury foreman answered, "Guilty of murder in the 1st degree." Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone were also found guilty, and just like that, one of the most powerful crime bosses in America had been brought down. For the first time in his life, Lepke looked shaken. It was a huge win for prosecutors William O'Dwyer and Burton Turkus, and it made headlines across the country. What followed was a long series of appeals. Lepke's lawyers tried everything. They took the case to the New York State Court of Appeals and even to the US Supreme Court. They challenged the trial's fairness, questioned whether Abe Reles' testimony should have been allowed, and pointed to any possible legal misstep they could find. For more than 2 years, Lepke, Weiss and Capone waited on death row at Sing Sing. Lepke became the highest-ranking mafia boss in US history to face the death penalty. It set a serious precedent for the men who usually ran things from the shadows. By early 1943, all appeals had been denied. The end was now in sight. In a final effort to avoid the electric chair, the defense tried again. On January the 21st, 1944, federal agents finally turned Buchalter over to state authorities, who immediately transported him to Sing Sing prison.
In New York, Lepke, gangster boss of Murder Incorporated, leaves federal jail for Sing Sing's death house.
The night of Saturday, March the 4th, 1944, everything moved like clockwork. Following the strict routine the state had set for executions, the first to walk down the hall was Mendy Weiss, smart, dangerous, and loyal to the end. At 11:02 p.m, he entered the death chamber. He was strapped in the electric chair and pronounced dead within 3 minutes. Next came Louis Capone at 11:07 p.m. Stocky and quiet, Capone followed behind Weiss and met the same fate just as quickly, being pronounced dead at 11:10 p.m. Then it was Louis Lepke Buchalter's turn. His mouth was slightly open and his lower lip trembled. He looked briefly at the people sitting on the benches and then slowly scanned the faces of the men standing near the back door, along the wall, and to the right side of the room. For a second, it looked like he might say something. Lepke's eyes reached the last man in the row, and then he turned took 2 small steps and sat in the chair. 2 minutes later, Lepke Buchalter, one of the most feared men in organised crime, was dead. He was buried at the Mount Hebron Cemetery in Flushing, Queens.
The executions of Lepke, Weiss and Capone were more than just the end of 3 men. They marked the final chapter of Murder Inc. as a national crime operation. By then, most of their top killers were already gone. Some, like Harry Strauss and Frank Abendando, had already been executed. Others were locked away in prison. Abe Reles, the informant who helped bring the group down, was long buried in an unmarked grave. The mob would still exist, people would still get killed, but the idea of a single, organised hit squad working across the country, almost like a business, was finished. The end of Murder Inc. didn't end organised crime, and it didn't erase the violence that the group had become known for. Its influence stuck around for law enforcement, for the public, and for the men who survived it. Some of these men would go on to become even more dangerous. They had learned from what went wrong, and they saw new opportunities in the gaps that Murder Inc. left behind.
One man in particular came out of the whole thing not only untouched, but stronger: Albert Anastasia. At the time, Anastasia already held serious power. He controlled the Brooklyn docks and was a top figure in the Mangano crime family, but he wasn't satisfied with staying where he was. With Murder Inc. collapsing and many of its leaders gone, there were openings, territories, money, and influence up for grabs. Anastasia moved to claim what he could. Inside his own mafia family, there was tension. The boss, Vincent Mangano, and his brother Philip didn't trust Anastasia. They didn't like his temper or the fact that he was working closely with powerful, non-Italian gangsters. Anastasia was looking ahead. He saw a bigger role for himself, and nothing, not old loyalties, not the past, not even his own boss, was going to stop him. In April 1951, the Mangano brothers disappeared. Philip Mangano was found shot 3 times near Jamaica Bay in the Bergen Beach section of Brooklyn. His body was found hidden in the tall grass of the marshland south of Avenue Y, close to East 72nd Street in Brooklyn. Vincent Mangano's body was never found. Albert Anastasia was never officially charged, but in the world of organised crime, it was widely believed that Anastasia was behind their murders. With the approval of the Mafia Commission and support from powerful allies like Frank Costello and Joe Adonis, Anastasia took control of the Mangano crime family.
As boss, Anastasia was known for his short temper and paranoia, and he didn't hesitate to use violence to keep control. He allegedly liked to brag that he could have anyone killed with just 1 phone call, but his behaviour started to make others in the mafia uneasy. His reckless use of violence, especially when not approved from by the commission, and the attention he drew from the media made him a problem. Vito Genovese, the leader of the Genovese crime family, pointed out to the commission that Anastasia had been selling memberships to his crime family for $50,000, which was against the rules of the commission and made a lot of high-level mobsters very angry. Genovese also claimed that Anastasia had been losing a lot of money on horse races, which made him even more erratic and grumpy.
On May the 23rd, 1955, Albert Anastasia admitted to underreporting his income from the late 1940s and pled guilty to tax evasion. Just over a week later, on June the 3rd, he was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison and fined $20,000. After his sentencing, the federal government attempted to revoke his citizenship and have him deported. But that decision was overturned by a higher court on September the 19th, 1955. In Anastasia's absence, Frank Costello took over the family. In early 1957, Vito Genovese made his move to take control of the family from Frank Costello. On May the 2nd, Vincent the Chin Gigante shot Costello outside his apartment building. The injury wasn't serious, but it was enough to convince Costello to step down and to allow Genovese to take over. Genovese then became head of what is now known as the Genovese crime family. Joseph Bonanno later said he played a key role in preventing a war between Anastasia and Genovese by setting up a meeting where tensions were diffused. A few weeks later, on June the 17th, Anastasia's underboss Frank Scalise was murdered. Scalise had been involved in selling family memberships just as Anastasia had, and according to mob informant Joe Velacci, Anastasia approved the killing as well as the later murder of Scalise's brother Joseph, even after Joseph had tried to make peace. Thus, Anastasia's fate was sealed. Albert Anastasia's end came in the same violent way he had lived. On the morning of October the 25th, 1957, he was getting a shave at the Park Sheraton Hotel at 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. He was in the barber's chair when two men with scarves over their faces rushed in, pushed the barber aside, and started shooting. Anastasia jumped up in shock, swung at the mirror, thinking it was one of the gunmen, and then collapsed to the floor. He died right there in a pool of blood, ending his time as one of the most feared men in the Mafia. The hit was believed to have been carried out by Crazy Joe Gallo and his brothers, members of the Proficiency crime family, who would later become the Colombo crime family. It was said they were acting on orders from Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese, who both wanted New York shut of the hostile Albert Anastasia. After Anastasia's death, Gambino quickly took over as boss. His style was quieter, more careful, and his rule would last far longer. Under him, the family became one of the most powerful in the history of organised crime. Another former member of Murder Inc., who took a different but still violent path after the group fell apart, was Frankie Carbo. Carbo was a soldier in the Lucchese crime family and had been involved in several killings whilst working for Murder Inc. One of the most well-known cases tied to him was the 1939 murder of potential informant Harry Greenberg, sanctioned by Lepke Buchalter. Carbo and Bugsy Siegel were both charged in that case, but the trial ended with a hung jury after Abe Reles died.
When the Murder Inc. trials were over, Carbo didn't stop. Instead, he shifted his focus to professional boxing, a business that looked legal on the surface but was full of behind-the-scenes control. He became part of a group of mobsters known as the Combination, who had a tight grip on the sport in the 1940s and 1950s. Carbo was often called the Tsar of boxing, even though he didn't have a boxing license or official role. He had the power to decide who fought whom, which managers succeeded, and who won or lost in the ring. Many believed he fixed fights and used threats to control boxers and promoters. Big names like Jake LaMotta and Sonny Liston were said to be under his control. Carbo's methods didn't change much. He still used fear and violence to get what he wanted, just like he had with Murder Inc.
In the early 1950s, his name came up during the Kefauver Committee hearings, which were looking into organised crime in America. These hearings started to show the public just how deep Carbo's reach was in boxing, but it took several more years before law enforcement seriously came after him. After a 3-month trial where US Attorney General Robert Kennedy acted as the prosecutor, Carbo was given a 25-year prison sentence. He served time in several prisons, including Alcatraz, McNeil Island in Washington, and the Federal Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Because of serious health issues, Carbo was granted early parole and released. He passed away in Miami Beach, Florida on November the 9th, 1976. Other people connected to Murder Inc. had very different outcomes. Charles the Bug Workman was tried in the murder of Dutch Schultz on October the 23rd, 1935. He managed to avoid the death penalty, but was sentenced to life in prison in 1941. In 1964, he was granted parole and later found work in the clothing business.
Some of the men who cooperated with the authorities and managed to stay alive eventually disappeared from the public. Irving Cohen, also known as Big Gangy, changed his name and made his way into acting. In 1939, he appeared in the film Golden Boy, playing a former boxer named Jack Gordon. A former policeman recognised Cohen from the film and alerted authorities. Cohen, along with Murder Inc. member Jack Dragner, ended up on trial with other members of Murder Inc. for the murder of Walter Sage. Cohen was found not guilty on June the 21st, 1940. Outside of acting, Cohen also worked in boxing. Between 1935 and 1965, he managed a number of fighters, including Rocky Graziano, Walter Cartier, Irish Bob Murphy, and Billy Graham. By the early 1960s, he was managing Lou Stillman's gym in New York City, where he helped organise boxing matches at venues like St. Nicholas Rink and Sunnyside Gardens in Queens. As time passed and Murder Inc. faded from the headlines, the need for actors with gangster looks like Cohen's had also declined. Acting roles became harder to find, and one of his last known appearances was as a stunt performer on the TV show Bonanza in 1965. Cohen died on June the 25th, 1991 at Scottsdale Memorial Hospital in Arizona. He was later buried in Los Angeles County. As for Blue Jaw Magoon, well, he disappeared in 1943. He was in a relationship with a girl called Evelyn Mittelman, who was also known to be very cooperative with anyone who would spend money on her and had a particular liking for gangsters. So effectively, she would set up her boyfriends for cash and thus was dubbed the Kiss of Death Girl by the press at the time. No one knew what happened to Blue Jaw until, in 2003, his skeleton was found buried in the desert in Las Vegas, potentially silenced by other gangsters, or maybe he just got on the wrong side of someone. Anyway, he had died the way he had lived. In the end, the Murder Inc. model, a centralised team of killers that worked across different crime families, was never used in the same way again. The consequences had been too serious. There were major trials, huge media attention, and the shocking execution of a top mob boss like Lepke. It showed everyone just how risky the whole system was. The mafia leaders saw what could happen too when too many hitmen were involved, especially when one of them might flip and talk to the authorities. After that, mob killings didn't stop, but the way they were done changed. Hits became more private, usually handled within each family. If they needed help from the outside, it was done quietly and only when absolutely necessary. The killing business didn't disappear, it just went underground, got quieter and more careful. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you like this video, please do like and subscribe, and if you really enjoyed it, then please consider becoming a channel member, where for $5 a month you'll get access to our private Discord, more content like this each month, monthly live streams, and much more. So if that sounds of interest to you, then please do consider becoming a channel member. If not, then thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.